to see me now, 'cause lately you've been feeling down. You lay awake alone at night. Oh, pack your life inside a car, forget the world and drive real far. Put that record on again. Oh, my love, it's you and I. Close, close, and cool like this fire. So reach for the stars, 'cause we're aiming high. I'm dreaming if you, I dream of a new life. Fight in the dark till we see the sunlight. My love, it's you and I. Close, close, and cool like this fire. So reach for the stars, 'cause we're aiming high. I can't wait to leave this town. Wait to leave this town, 'cause lately I've been feeling down.
Testing, testing. Are we live? Let's do a quick live check. Are we live? One sec. Do a quick. Yes, we are live. We got audio. We are good to go. Sweet. Welcome. G'day. G'day, everybody. G'day. PowerShell 101 Live is back. We are today going to be smashing it. Deep dive today. So it's 1 hour. Sorry, got 2 hours. We're going to be smashing 2 topics in 1 hour each. So this is going to be intense. So yeah, this is going to be probably a lot of info for you guys. But at the end of the day, it's going to be good. Fair bit of theory to cover. At the same time, there's going to be demos. So we're going to be obviously, it's going to be about 50-50. We're going to try and get through the theory as quickly as possible, but the theory obviously is really important to understand what we're actually doing. So feel free to follow along. You can jump on Visual Studio Code Live if you're on the Discord server, and you can basically see the demos and we're going through together. So you can also obviously ask questions in chat or ask questions wherever. So feel free to jump into Discord as well if you want to ask questions. That's completely fine. Let me just quickly unmute myself in there because I have myself muted. So you can jump in there, say g'day if you want to, or if you've got any questions. So let's get stuck into it. So first thing, so agenda. So today, basically we're going to be focusing on 2 elements. I was kind of thinking about putting them into 2 separate streams, and I'm like, oh, we can jam them together, which is we're just going to be looking at object-oriented programming from a theory perspective. We're just going to be covering a little bit more than what we covered last week, and then also we're going to be covering PowerShell and objects. So more about objects itself within PowerShell and how it does. How it handles, or how we do things within PowerShell with objects. And at the very end, we're going to do a tiny bit of classes within PowerShell. So obviously, we're going to be looking at PowerShell-based classes. This is something that is going to be real heavy, but I'm going to try and step you guys off into the shallow end, and then we're going straight down into the deep end. So strap yourself in, because this is going to be pretty intense. So one of the things I've always going to do for my projects is, also with my courses, is that basically have an assessment piece. Obviously, assessment piece is completely optional. Think of it as homework. Essentially, it's just backing up what you've learned. So if you're following along and you're writing the code as you go, some people might be able to write this code immediately, which is completely fine. But as you learn something, you might be wanting to refactor and adjust your code to be more suitable. Generally speaking, you always will write code to your standards, and then from that, you'll if you've learned something new, you'll retailor it to that. So this will hopefully help you see yourself improve within PowerShell. So the assessment piece, we double tapped. The assessment piece is we're going to automate the following, which is we're going to, using Client Hyper-V, we're going to build a VM. We're going to install Windows 10 on that VM. On the VM, we're going to install OBS Studio version 24, or the latest version. I think it's 24.1 now, that's just released. And also going to install Visual Studio Code on the VM. So it's a basic 4 steps, but essentially I didn't want to make it overly complicated, but I just kind of wanted to be able to get you guys to automate something. So this is a really good way of doing some sort of automation. It's a really good example. So it's just basically a lot more infrastructure focused. So generally speaking, a lot of you guys who are watching are going to be infrastructure. So this is just a nice little easy way of doing it. You can use VMware if you want. It's all good, but yeah, definitely give it a go. All right, let's get stuck into it. For 9:04, we've got 56 minutes. All right, object-oriented programming. So I wish I had my spoon. I don't have any dirty dishes around me. All right, so I was going to do a quick recap from last week. So last week we talked about what is object-oriented programming. So essentially, it's just a methodology of using methodology that is used to group executable code together with various actions, code and memory. I'm not going to really go much into more detail with that. It's just basically yep, sorry, I just thought we'd just jump the slide. I think it's just that's a really easy way to do it, explain it. So classes are basically blueprints of objects. Objects are basically instantiated from classes, or they're the created, they're a physical representation of that class. So if we've got this guitar pick here, basically the guitar pick is an object. It's a physical representation. The class for this would be a blueprint of a pick. So it would basically all the attributes that makes this a pick, whether it's the type of pick it is, the texture, the stiffness, the shape, the size, all those kinds of things would define the characteristics of the pick. Within that, obviously, objects contain properties and methods. So properties are basically values that you can set in memory, and a method is basically executable code. So if we use the concept of the spoon, again, a spoon is a physical representation, is an object. The blueprint to create the spoon is the actual class. So the blueprint for a spoon will basically be the same for a teaspoon versus a normal soup spoon versus a normal spoon versus an ice cream scoop. Ice cream scoop might be its own class because it has some like extra little features, but essentially let's just call them all the same. They're a spoon. So basically the class would be a spoon. They just have different properties and different they have different properties that describe the spoon differently in terms of size, in terms of makeup, in terms of metals, things like that. So that's basically that. Fairly straightforward. I'm just going to quickly fire up the chat because I just lost my chat. Where's my chat? One sec. Where's my chat? Oh, I lost my chat. I'm just going to fire it up. All right, we're back. Okay, it is on. Okay, cool. I thought it wasn't on. All right, well, that's good. So let's keep going. So that's pretty straightforward. That's basically what we kind of covered last week. I didn't really want to go into any further detail because I kind of just wanted to, you guys to just get your toes dipped into the water. We're not going to go too deep, but that's going to change today. So we're actually going to change it up a little bit more. So you guys can obviously, we're going to explore this a little bit further. All right, first things first, we need to talk about what a PowerShell variable is. I know some of you guys, this is really super basic, but I kind of was writing this, I was reviewing my lesson this morning and I kind of thought, if I don't actually do this, I'm assuming that they know what I'm talking about with a $PowerShell variable, and that could potentially be bad. So basically, I'm just thinking, all right, we're going to take one step back. It is for, beginner 101, so we are going to discuss it. So essentially, a variable is a unit of memory which values can be stored. It's simple as that. It's very, very basic. It's represented by a dollar and a value. So for example, you can see there, we'll just quickly draw, grab my pen out. Let's grab the pen. We'll grab the pen. So you got dollar and value, dollar value. It's simple as that. So basically, that's a variable. To actually set a value, so this would be the equivalent of a read. If you wanted to read something. If you want to write something or set, we call it read. Actually, it's technically a get. We're just going to use a get. I can't really write with a mouse, but you guys get the gist. It's a get or a read. Basically, if we're setting or writing, write set. In C#, it's basically they denote as get set. Now, I am going to use C# terminology, and the reason why is simply because PowerShell is built on C#. So a lot of this is just kind of helps you prepare yourself to actually, when you need to, move into C#. Set. All right. So once we've done that, basically WriteSet. As you can see, it's denoted by, you specify your variable with an equals. Now, the equals is basically an operator that sets a memory value. It's basically explicit. So what I mean by that is it will overwrite any previous values. It basically is, this is it. This is the B's. There's no sort of adding into the end or anything like that. It's explicit. It will set that explicit string and that string only. So for example, if I wanted to change it and I wanted to change it to hello world 2 and this was already set, as this was already set in memory, it would the new value would be hello world 2. It wouldn't be hello world. Now there's other operators there in terms of that you can do really cool things. So you can add and subtract. You can basically add to an array and things like that. We are going to talk about adding to an array, but we're not going to talk about adding and subtracting. So that's just in another lesson. So that's basically your PowerShell variable. If you've got questions, fire them through. It's totally fine. We can definitely get to them. All right. So one of the things I wanted to talk about with objects is that they actually also contain events. Now, events is not as important in PowerShell as they're important with C# or any sort of other, especially object-oriented language. But events essentially are still really, really important to understand because sometimes you might need to use it. So this is something that I don't expect as a 101. It's good to be aware of, but you really, like, I very rarely use events in PowerShell, but it's always good to know that they're there. So basically what events are basically enable a class or an object to notify other classes of objects when something of interest occurs. So when we mean by something of interest, something of interest could be, let's say, an added file to the file system, a process has been closed, a button has been clicked. Those are what we call events because they're something of interest. Now, I'm just taking this definition straight from C#. This is not PowerShell, because PowerShell does use events, but it doesn't really. You can use it, but it's really, not many people. It's really, it's something that you generally don't use every day. As for systems administration, you generally don't use every day. So the class that sends the event or raises, so basically there are two types of terminology, but essentially the same thing. When you raise an event, it's called the publisher. And the classes that receive or handle the event is the subscriber. So think of it as you've got the left side here, it's gone, there's a file system object's been raised, and you want to execute some code over here. Then you have the subscriber that's basically being, hey, is there anything new? Is there anything new? Is there anything new? No, there's nothing new. Is there anything new? And when this says, hey, there's something new, it then goes, hey, I've got something, and now I can execute it. That's probably the easiest way to explain it in terms of what an event is. It's very useful. It's generally, that's pretty much how most GUI's powered. It's just powered on events and things like that. Essentially, it's not essential. Like, it's not something that you guys need to know, but it's just always good to know. To register an event, you can use register object event to create it. To create an event, or to register an event, you can use register object event. Now, one thing that I just really want to quickly mention, this is something I was kind of writing and I thought about it, and actually this is something that I wish I learnt from the get-go. Events only exist in the PowerShell run space. So what I mean by that is if you have two PowerShell processes side by side, and you have an event registered in this one PowerShell process, it will not execute in this other PowerShell process. It's just not the case. PowerShell only executes within, it will only execute events within its own run space, aka its own process. So if you've got two processes sitting side by side and you're wondering why it's not working, that's why. It just doesn't work. So there's obviously, if you guys are on Discord, you can see there's the OneDrive link, so you can definitely follow through with the PowerPoint as well. We are on lesson 01 because I'm following a array naming standard. So first lesson was lesson 00, and we're now in, this is lesson 01. So if you want to jump on the slides, you can go take a look at that. Alrighty, let's keep going. So methods. I really want to. We're going to take a little bit more of a deep dive into methods, and we're going to take it into properties as well. So there's really in PowerShell. I'm not going to go into too much depth because this is you're kind of going into a bit too much to C#, and we're losing a little bit of the PowerShell, but it's still good to understand. There's two types of methods in PowerShell. The first method is a static method. Static methods can be executed without instantiating the object. And what I mean by instantiating, I basically mean creating the object. So what I mean by that is you can actually reference the object type. So for example, we'll look at this in a string, but basically if you go, a really good example is, we can actually just quickly open up Visual Studio Code. 1 second. Let me just quickly go to VS Code. I'll just create a new file. We're going to go lesson 01 methods, like so. We basically got two, and we're going to use strings. So we're going to go a static method, and we're going to go a non-static method. So a static method is the equivalent of what I don't expect you. We're going to cover this a little bit later, so I don't want you to kind of freak out because I'm going too quickly. We are going to cover specific aspects. So I'm going to say this is an object type string, which is basically denoted by the square braces. And then I'm just going to use a double colon. That's basically telling PowerShell, hey, I want to execute a static method, and then basically we can use is null or empty. This is a static method because it exists outside of the object. We don't need to instantiate the object to use it. However, this is the equivalent. Like I'm not going to go. Can you make yourself a bit smaller? Oh, sorry, did I flick it? Oh, sorry guys. Sorry guys. That was, I keep forgetting that all the time. Sorry about that. Let me just quickly backtrack quickly. I completely stuffed that. Sorry. So like I just quickly said, we've got, obviously PowerShell variables. So you got read get, WriteSet, basically denoted by $var equals. I just quickly want to make sure that everyone's across that before we, before we go any further, because that's going to be something that's important. So if we go back here, we got our string. So it's going to go, this is our string. And then here, I can address some specific methods. Now these methods are basically only accessible once the string has been created, once the object has been instantiated. So for example, if I try to do a string and we call the method is null or empty, it doesn't exist because the static method exists only outside of the object. A non-static method exists inside the object. So that's basically a quick example of static and non-static methods. Now, I can quickly jump back into it. Parameters of a method basically allows you to send and receive data. So it's similar to PowerShell parameters in the previous lesson. They basically provide input. So think of them as like when you declare a method, it has two inputs. think of it, the method as a DVD player, and it has two buttons. Oh, sorry, it has one button, play, and it has an open button to open the DVD drive. So when you click the open button and the play button, there's your two parameters that you want to use. So it's a bit of a weird thing to think about, but essentially they just think of them as like a physical input, a button on an interface. Basically similar to parameters are separated by commas. So as you can see here, we've got our parameters down here. We've got object.method. So the object is denoted by the dollar or the variable. And then the method is denoted by the method name and then the brackets or the parentheses. So this is an example. So we've just got object.method and we've got each of our parameters are denoted by are delimited by or separated by our commas. So you can see there we've got string, comma, to, comma, hello. So that means there's three inputs into that method. So if we quickly go back to Visual Studio Code, you can see this here. So we've got the replace method. So we've got string.replace replaces the method. String is the variable. It's got this, and it's separated by a dot. And then we've got we've denoted the method by opening the parentheses, and then each of the parameters that we're passing into the method is basically separated by a comma. So if we actually run this code, we're going to quickly run this code. You can see this piece of code, this method in the string object, what it does is it replaces the word string or the text string with hello. And so initially, if we were to run this code up top here, we should see it will say this is a string. You can see there this is a string. And if we rerun that, and then we can see now this is a hello. So it's replaced string with hello. So that essentially is what a method is. Any questions? All right, let's keep going. All right, so the next thing we're going to be talking about is properties. So basically, I'm just looking at my notes, sorry. So essentially, properties, I'm just kind of having a bit of a memory blank for a sec. Basically, properties are literally just, like we talked about, they're just memory values of an object. So you can, similar to, think of them as a whole bunch of variables that you attach to a project. That's the easiest way to think of it. Now, there's two real big flavors of properties in PowerShell. We've got what we call the public and the private, or the hidden. Now, this is somewhat important in PowerShell, since PowerShell has a form of this. In C# and things like this, it is specific. So I'm going to we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but essentially it's good to know. So you guys are having a bit of an understanding of object-oriented programming. So essentially, we've got a private property. Private properties or hidden properties are accessible only by the internal object. So what that basically means is that if you wanted to access that property outside of it by the parent, you can't. It doesn't exist. That technically is not the case, because the way that PowerShell handles what we call a PowerShell class, so if we create a custom PowerShell class, it's hidden, and I use the word hidden, but you can essentially go find it. It doesn't, it hides it, but you can still go get the memory value. It's not technically hidden. And then essentially public is exactly what it sounds like. It's accessible to the caller or the parent. So to set a property is exactly the same as setting a variable. Well, basically, you got your object. I'm just going to quickly flick to my ink, wherever my ink is. Oh, no, that's a laser pointer. So essentially, we've got our object. We've got our property name. That's basically the equivalent of a get. And then we've got an object.property name, and then we've denoted the equals, and we're setting a value. So the value can be whatever we want it to be, essentially within its type. So if the type is an integer and you try and set a string, it will fail because it's type specific. If you try and set a string to a string, it'll succeed. If you set an integer to an integer, it'll succeed. But yeah, essentially, that's how you read and write properties. Alrighty. Oh, better clear the ink because I forgot to do it last time, and I was like, what's all this drawing on there? And it was looking really bad. We're also going to quickly touch on collections, lists, arrays. There's many ways to call it. Technically, PowerShell's official naming standard for is collections or arrays. List is more C#. I kind of just threw lists in there because if you kind of have a little bit of C#, it just helps you to articulate what it is. So essentially, it's just a group of objects that can be selected by an index. That's basically what an array is. Essentially, it's just a data structure that's designed to store information, a collection of items, and you can basically index those items. So think of it as an Excel spreadsheet, and you've got, let's just fire up Excel actually. We can just do this. It's the easiest way to explain it is it's an Excel spreadsheet. You've got a whole bunch of different values in there, and we can index by going through each of them. You can have multi-dimensional array, so this is what we call a one-dimensional array because it's just a list. This is a two-dimensional array because it's basically you can have essentially it's just a square. You can have three-dimensional arrays. I've worked with three-dimensional arrays, and then I tried to work with a four-dimensional array, and then everything just went to hell because four-dimensional arrays is just instances of three-dimensional arrays, and then that's like, yeah, very difficult to wrap your head around. But essentially, an array is just a list. Now, we talk collections arrays, and we use them interchangeably, but essentially they're the same thing. They're just a group of objects that can be selected by an index. So you can basically collect a whole bunch of information. With it, you can group objects, you can group, different types, things like that. Now, I just quickly mentioned you can group different types, and this is something that's quite interesting because I kind of contradicted this, which is kind of hilarious. It's technically type specific, technically, but PowerShell does handle this. It handles this well. So you can have string, integers, you can have every type of object under the sun. It doesn't care. It really doesn't care. It's always good to make them type specific because it means it's a little bit more efficient. It's a bit more easy to read. But essentially, you can do whatever you want there if you really wanted to. Now, you use indexing to access each individual object or item within the array. I'm just going to put item there. So what I mean by that is you can actually, to do that, you specify the array variable. And then you're basically using your square brackets. So if we quickly go here, we go var, then we go square brackets. We specify the number, and that will basically represent the item within it. So if we think back to Excel, it's essentially this. So if we were to access let's just use this as an example. So if we wanted to access in our array, A would basically represent A1. Now in an actual array, it would be basically 1. But essentially, that's how we index into it. Now, one thing that's really important to remember about arrays within PowerShell is that they're zero-based. The first item within an array will be 0. So if you start at 1, you're going to technically have the second item within the array. You're not going to have the first item. So remember, it's zero-based. So if you want to get the first item, you basically go brackets 0. Now, a really cool thing is if you want to get the last item and you don't know how to, you don't know the length of the array, really quick and cool, dirty way of doing it is just use -1. And what that says is, hey, go get me the last item in the array. So nice little shortcut for you guys, but essentially that's how we index into arrays. It's denoted by the @ and parentheses operator. Now this is something that's really important. You don't need it. PowerShell kind of works around it. It's good to use it for readability point of view, so that basically you're not kind of shooting yourself in the foot in terms of it's easy to read, so you're not kind of going, is this an array, is this not an array? It's just easy to understand from a readability point of view, but essentially you don't need it. I actually just tested that to make sure that was 100% sure. I was 100% sure with that. So that's essentially your arrays. Do you guys have any questions with regards to that? I'm just going to give you guys a couple of seconds. I'm going to give 15 seconds. Cool. All right, let's keep going. All right, so objects, classes. So when we create a class in PowerShell, it needs to contain the following. It doesn't need, okay. Technically it doesn't need these. It doesn't need, okay. Sorry, I'm just kind of thinking about this. So PowerShells need to PowerShell classes have to contain one of the following of the three items, which is the constructor. So basically, a constructor is a special method that runs on creation, so it allows you to do cool things with it. With that, PowerShell classes contain also a property. So properties like we talked about, you can get and set memory values, and methods, so you can execute code. You can't basically in PowerShell classes, you can't set events because it's just not supported. But essentially, it contains these three. The first one is a must. This is a must because constructors is the process of having a constructor when you instantiate an object, the constructor is what gets run after the on creation. So for example, let's say you create a specific object for an apple. By default, let's say you're associating the apple is going to be a Granny Smith apple, then you're going to set the color to be green. So you would basically set in the default constructor, or what we call the default constructor, you would set the value to be green. So it just means that what you're doing there is you're taking, you're shortcutting your code, so essentially you don't have to rewrite that piece of code over and over again. When you instantiate an object, you're like, yep, I just want to run that specific piece of code. Yep. And it'll set all those little bits up. Now, there's other times that you don't want that to happen because there might be other times that you want to set other values, and we're going to really quickly talk about that in a sec. We're going to talk about that now. So I'm just going to quickly clear my screen. I've got a really itchy nose. Okay, so we're going to talk about, I've got objects continue, classes continue. So we're going to talk about constructors and methods, support overloading. Now you guys are thinking, oh God, we are literally we're now stepping into the deep dive of classes. We're just putting our foot in there, so just so you guys can get a bit of an understanding of why, what we can do with PowerShell. So constructors and methods support overloading by the number of parameters, the data type, and the order. So what overloading essentially is, overloading is having the same method in your class or in your class multiple times. So you could have the method run, for example. Let's use the method run. You could have that 20 times. And in those 20 times, they could all have different parameters. So for example, when you're creating an object, and let's say we'll use the Granny Smith apple as an example. You don't want a Granny Smith apple. You want a Red Delicious apple or a Pink Lady apple. So basically, they would be a different. They could be a different method to set all those bits and pieces up. So rather than actually having all this complicated code, you can overload what we call overload your methods, and then you can do it that way. Now, the thing with methods, the overloading is it's specific. It's dependent on the parameters. And what I mean by that is you can basically have the number of parameters. So you could have one method that has one parameter, and you could have another method that has two parameters. That's fine. That actually will support overloading. You could have the type. And so what I mean by this is we've got hello world is int. This is actually a really bad example because technically that's not true, but is type int. So this method would return an integer. So it'll return 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Where this one would return hello Michael. it returns a string. So the type of return is also able to be used. So you can have the same amount of parameters. Actually, let me get rid of that. You can have the same amount of parameters, but different types. That's completely fine. The final one, it's worth mentioning, but I'm going to tell you now, it's not supported in PowerShell classes. This is just something that's worth mentioning, is the order. So in C#, you can have them interchangeably. So you can have a string and then an integer, string and then an integer, and then an integer, and then a string. That's fine in C#. PowerShell, I had issues with it. So generally speaking, the easiest way most people use is this type. Because essentially, generally speaking, if you're going to have multiple parameters, it's usually you're trying to do something else with the code. But overloading is really, really cool because it means that you can simplify your code and it makes it much more easier to manage. All right, it's 9:30 and we basically hit that half time or that quarter time, which is really good. All right, it's demos. Let's get some demos going. So what we're going to do, I've just got my notes on the side here. So I'm going to open a Visual Studio Code. So we're going to write some, we're actually going to write, just going to rename this. I'm just going to rename this. Actually, yeah, sorry. Actually, no, we can use this one. All right. Actually, no. Object-oriented programming. So I'm just cleaning this up, making it a bit more readable for me. I'm just going to call it OOP because it's going to take too long to write it out and I can't spell today. All right, so demo. So we're going to see some variables in action. All right, so we're just going to quickly talk about, obviously we've talked about setting variables. So we're just going to go, you guys can obviously follow along. So what we're going to do, we're just going to call this myvar. Actually, we're just going to go, this is our variable. We're just going to create two strings. So what we can do now is let's execute that. So what I'm just doing using Visual Studio Code, so I can just highlight this and press F8 to execute this. And we're going to scroll down here. I'm just going to clear this up. So for now, we've basically run the set command on myvar. Now that means and var. So that means those values exist in memory. So we can check that by going myvar, and there it is. There's the value. So now we've run the equivalent to a get. Now this is really cool because let's say you want to do something, for example, within a method. Let's just use a method, for example. We're just going to put this into a method. So what we're going to do is we're declaring another variable called, let's call it result. We're going to basically have a myvar. And we're going to replace a, so the character, the string a, or the character a, in this instance it's a character, and we're going to replace it with var. So what we're doing here is we're actually inserting the variable as a, instead of actually as a static string into the method. So this is really why you have your methods, because you can basically pass your variables and items into it. So now if we rerun this, we should see as we should see in the variable result, it should be this is C Windows System 32 variable. So if we now run results, so down the bottom here, you can see that there it is. This is C System 32. Now what's really interesting is that you see how it's we've got this multi kind of we've got multiple strings being replaced. It's kind of C Windows System 32 has been it's replaced in there 3 times. The reason why is because there's 3 A's in that string. Now if we want to fix that up, we just wrap a space around it. The reason why is because what we're doing is we're looking at the string and we're saying, hey, I just want to replace that with that. So now if we rerun this, oops, sorry. There we go. Now it's obviously not spaced, but essentially you get the idea. Now if we want to space it out, we actually can do this. We can actually put what I've basically said here is this is a string, and this is the variable inside the string. So what PowerShell will do here is it actually will insert the variable into that string. So think of it as it's denoted the string in memory. So it's created literally a string with two blank spaces with two spaces on each side, and then it's inserted the variable value, which is C Windows System 32, into that. So now if we rerun this again and we recall result, I'm just going to clear the screen. You can see that now we've got a nicely spaced variable. So that's just a really cool example of that. I'm just going back to my notes. I'm not going, I had something in my notes here to create a custom object event in PowerShell. I don't know if I really want to, I don't think it's relevant at this point in time because I'm just going to quickly end the slideshow. Discard. And the only reason why I'm thinking that is because, do you guys want to see an event in PowerShell? I'm just going to ask you guys because realistically, I'm just kind of thinking about it going, is this something you guys really want to see? So let me know in the comments. I'm going to continue on, but we can definitely come back to that if we need to. Okay, cool. All right, well, let's do it. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to create an event in PowerShell. So what we're going to firstly do is we're going to go a timer event. So we're going to create a timer. We're going to now create a new object. So we're instantiating an object called timers. I'm just going through my notes and I don't think it's actually correct. Oh, it is. It is correct. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of a memory blank. So we're going to go timers.timer. Timers is a what we call, I should have talked about run spaces, but timers is what we call a run space, which is basically just a class of a class. That's the best way to describe it. It's just a class of a class, a parent class, and timer is our class, and then we're creating an object from that. We're going to set our interval. VAL. So what this is going to do is we're going to create a timer object and we're going to register in a PowerShell. Now this timer object is going to trigger code on the interval. So the interval can be how many seconds has passed, or in this instance it's actually done in milliseconds. So we can go timer.interval and then we can go 1000. So it's in milliseconds, so everything's in 1000. So now after that we're going to create an event subscription. So this event subscription basically is telling PowerShell, hey, I want to create an event. So we can go register object event. And we're going to basically go, our input object is our timer. So we're actually passing the timer object. And we're going to use the event in the timer object. So quickly show you guys that. If we go get member, you must specify an object. Oh, I haven't. The reason why that has existed is because I actually haven't executed the code. Now the code is executed. You know, in the previous. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly clean up this because Visual Studio Code gets really weird when it doesn't like handling previous lines. All right, so we're going to now do timer.get method, and get method, remember, is basically going to return all the objects and properties, events for an object. So you can see here, the event we're going to be used is elapsed. That's the event we're going to be using. So we're going to use elapsed. I'm just going to copy and paste it because I can't spell for nuts. After that, we're now going to use our source identifier. So source identifier is going to be timer.output. Let's just one sec, sorry. Now timer.output is basically just a it's just a type. It's basically how it's going to handle it. So essentially, I don't expect you guys to fully understand it now. Like I've just kind of obviously I just want to demo this. What we're going to go is go write host, and then we're going to go 1 second has passed, like so. So you can see here we've now registered our object. We're actually going to go ahead and register it. So we're going to set our interval because the object already exists because we've created it. And we're going to now, actually we can just rerun the whole lot, that's fine. It now exists. But nothing's happening. The reason why nothing's happening is because with a timer object, we actually need to tell it to start. And the way we do that is we go timer dot enabled equals true. And there we go. So I'm not touching PowerShell right now. Like I can still do stuff in PowerShell. And now this is running an event. So that's basically how events work in PowerShell. The timer now has triggered an event which is now running that piece of code which is write host 1 second has passed. So the problem is, you can see here I'm writing code and now it's all, it's kind of having fun with my computer. So what we can do is, I'm going to do this. So I'm going to now disable it. Now true in PowerShell is a Boolean value. It's basically either a 1 or a 0. So what we're just saying there is turn on. So if we're now going to go enable and we go false, what I'm going to do is turn it off and the event is now disabled. I can re-enable it and it'll keep going, but essentially we can obviously toggle toggle it on and off. So that's basically an event. Cool. Alrighty. So the next thing is we talked about static methods, so that actually is really, really cool. So we actually don't need to demo that. We're going to now demo setting and getting a property. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a property. I'm just trying to think of an item that we can set that's easy. All right, let's just we'll cover this in the second part of of this lesson. So don't just think I'm jumping the gun here, but I'm just trying to object. I just kind of need to quickly spin up an object so I can actually show you guys. Yeah, it doesn't need that. New object type, PS object, member. And member type. So we're going to make that blank. See if this is going to play ball. Okay, so what I've just done here is I've just created a quick object in PowerShell. We're going to cover this later, but I just kind of want to obviously demo the specific. Want to demo this an object in PowerShell. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to get the property. Actually, we're going to set it and then we're going to get it. So to set the property, we're basically going to specify the object, so $object. We're then going to specify the dot, and you can see there Visual Studio Code has actually come back and it's already found that specific property. So we're going to use the test. So we created a test property when we did this. We basically created a member and we created a note property and the name is test. So then we can say hello world, like so, and then we're going to get the property. as you can see, it's not case sensitive either. So let's set it. Now the property has been set, and let's go get it. And there it is. So we can clear it again. So we can basically say, oh, let's clear it. Let's clear it. Like so. And if we get it again, oops, it's cleared. So that's essentially getting and setting a property. Alrighty, so I'm just quickly going through static methods, done that. Show collection of objects. Okay, one of the things I quickly want to show you is what a collection of objects looks like, or an array or a collection. So we're going to use get process because it's easiest thing to use. So if we go collection, you can call this array, you can call this whatever. I just use it for obviously readability. We can go get process. So we're running get process and we're storing it in this variable. So if we run this and then we call collection, that's a collection of objects. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different information about that. Now we can actually index into each object. So I can quickly show you that. So what we can do there is we use the square brackets. So this is not denoting type in this instance. This is denoting the index. If it's after a variable, it's an index. If it's before, it's really a type. That's the easiest way to remember it. Before, type, after, variable. Index. So we can go 1. That will get me the first one. So let's get let's get the first one. Oh, sorry, the second one. The first one's 0. Sorry. I just get the second one. Get the last one. So what we can do here is if we get the first one, you can see there's that object. Now that object is fully featured. So if we go run and get member on it, we can see all the information, all the properties. Now you can see that there's more properties that are actually listed on the when we actually reference them. Those properties are all accessible. It's just that when we want to have a quick look at it, PowerShell will just return the defaults. If you want to look at all of them, you can use format list, like so, and then just use a star, and then we can see all the properties of that specific object. So that's a really good example of that. So that's basically the first one in that collection. We can now get the second one. So this is the second one. So if we quickly have a look at the first one again, there's the first one, there's the second one, and let's get the last one. So we just use a -1 there, and there's the last one. We can actually see that if we run that right down the bottom there, and we can see your phone. So that's a really cool thing with indexing into arrays. Cool. And finally, we are going to have a quick example of overloading. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to declare, we're going to create a string. Now I'm not expecting you to fully understand the methods that I'm calling, but I just want you to make sure, I'm just trying to demonstrate what the concept of what we call overloading. So we're going to now use what we call the substring method to basically look at characters. Look at characters. We're going to have a quick look. Yeah, we look inside the character. We look at the characters within the string. Sorry. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go string dot substring. Now there's different methods. All this is documented online. So if you want to have a quick look, you can just jump online. I'll quickly show you guys that now quickly. You can just Google it. So SS64 is a really good site. I really like it. So you can see here, we've got a start index, we've got a length. Actually, technically this is not an overload, but I just kind of want to explain it. So our start index is the characters to skip from the start of the string. Use 0 to start from the beginning. Cannot be less than 0. And the length. Now in this instance, I kind of want you guys to think of it, this is an overload. Technically, this is actually the same method, but we're just going to treat this as an overload because you can have different parameters. So for example, we've got substring, we're going to go 1. That's going to return the first character. Oh, it's going to return all the other characters after the first character. So if we went 0, this is a string. If we go 1, it's going to return, it's going to return the first character and towards the end of the string. Now, if we want to overload it, it's not an overload, it's just a default, but essentially it's the same thing. You can add parameters to it. So we're going to say we want to start at 1 and then we want to read 3 characters forward. So basically we've got 2 sets of parameters that's denoted by that comma. And now if we run it again, you can see we returned his because we've started at the first and then we've read 3 characters. So that's 1, actually that. I was going to quickly look at the length. That should be a length of, yeah. So it basically starts here and it goes 1, 1, 2, 3, and it returns his. So that's pretty much that in terms of the demos. Do you guys, okay, what's the next on the thing? Questions. So do you guys have any questions? We've got about, what's the time? We've got about 5 minutes. So we can pretty much, got 5 minutes for questions before we need to go forward. Okay, cool. I'm just going to leave it open for about a couple of minutes. Maybe I'll just leave it open for a minute and then we'll, if any questions or, yeah. Just going to minimize that. Alrighty. I'm following along in Visual Studio Code. I usually just use red PS. Oh, okay, yep. I can see why I use this. Yeah, I really enjoy Visual Studio Code because it's a really easy tool. Especially they just keep adding more and more cool features. And so it just makes it much easier to, yeah. You mentioned that there'll be notes for this class on early. Are they outlined below or in GitHub? Okay, so you mentioned that there were notes for this class earlier. Oh, sorry, when I mean notes, I mean the PowerPoint slides. So if you want to grab the slides, yeah, sorry, I can actually send you the link. It's all on the Discord server, so I'll just quickly jump on Discord. Give me 2 secs. I just don't really like sharing out OneDrive links. Usually I'm just kind of like people to jump on a centralized link, but that's fine. Give me 2 secs. I'll just pop that in now. There you go. So that's just the, did that actually, oh no, I thought it suppressed the link for a second. I was like, what? No, so that's just the OneDrive link to the slides. So I'll add these demos afterwards, but essentially, yeah. That's pretty much, yeah, if you just watch that, that's where the slides are. Everything's replayable as well. So this is obviously simulcasting to Twitch and YouTube. So if you just search the Brisbane PowerShell user group, it's in there as well. So yeah, cool. Alrighty, so what we can do is let's keep going. We've got 3 minutes, which is good because we're now going down the rabbit hole. Alrighty, PowerShell and objects. So PowerShell and objects, this is, I just saw I forgot to remove some notes from my previous PowerPoint. It's like PowerShell Plano. No, this is PowerShell objects. So objects in PowerShell. So one of the things I quickly want to talk to you guys about in terms of when I'm talking about specific things, there's this little bit of terminology that basically helps you articulate what I'm saying when we talk about, for example, these different things. So for example, object type or type, think of it, the object type or type is the class, is the underlying class. So when when you think of string, so if we go back to, if we think of, if we jump in the pen here, sorry, I'm just kind of jumping the pen. We go, if we used our string, sorry, I can't write. I wish they actually had ability to write quick notes on here. They might actually. Pointer options, ink color options. No, I don't think it does. No, it doesn't. Oh well, that's all right. So when we talk string, this is the class type or type. So when you see things like, for example, if we went back to that previous demo, and we saw here in here, we basically are saying bracket string. That is the type string or the string class. So now type is denoted by the square brackets. So anything inside square brackets that's before a variable is technically a string. Anything that's after a variable, quickly, sorry, I'm just go back to Visual Studio again. Oop, I hit space. I don't know what that did. So anything before, for example, like this, would be declared as a type. Anything after, so if we talk about this, is declared as an index. So basically, if you see something like this, what you're looking at is essentially an array. You think, okay, that they're indexing into an array. When you're thinking something beforehand, think type. So type class. That's essentially it, really. So when we basically say string equals this is a string, we're saying, what we're actually saying here is we're actually being type specific. We're saying this is a string. And what I mean by that is the type of variable or object is of type string. Now, essentially, this will compile because it is a type string, because strings are denoted by double quote. Integer, however, this isn't type integer. Basically, I have declared my type by specifying the int class or the int type, and then I've have my integer variable declared, and I'm saying int equals this is type, or this is an integer. Well, that ain't an integer and that won't compile. That actually will not compile because that is a string with the double quotes and it's an integer. So what will happen is it's type specific, which means PowerShell will throw an error and it'll throw what we call a terminating error. We'll talk about that later. Alrighty, let's clear. Sweet. Let's keep going. Instantiating objects in PowerShell. There's 4 ways to do it to create an object or instantiating object in PowerShell. We're going to look at the 4 ways of doing it. It's each to their own, really. The standard is currently at the moment is this, object type new. Essentially, you can use new object. You can use what we call, you can specify the object type, specify the @ symbol with a curly brace, and an ending with a curly brace, and you can specify your key, your value. So key would be your property name, value would be your property value. We're going to see that. And you can use select object, or obviously, and also we can use object type new. So they're pretty much all the same. This one, however, sorry, that was an awful circle. I'm just going to erase that. That one is, it is the type, but the thing is that the way that this is when we talk about when it instantiates the object, it doesn't actually set all the attributes and it doesn't have all the niceties of, for example, this one of new object type, new, and select object. Now, select object by default outputs to what we call a PS object or a PS custom object. They're based, they are different, but they are essentially the same. There's slight performance differences between the two, but essentially a PS object or a PS custom object is essentially just a generic object for PowerShell. PowerShell it really operates on PS objects and PS custom objects. So if it doesn't know, if you don't want to type or you just kind of want something, PS custom object is the default go-to. It's a dynamically building object. New objects, you can obviously create this type, but yeah. Select objects are really more used for pipeline activities when you're actually really wanting to do things like, you can create custom objects in it, but it's really just quick, grabbing an existing object and then transforming, selecting a few properties from that object, maybe doing a transform, and then having your own little object that you can use. So that's really what select objects really used for. It's just being able to actually go and get that information. Obviously the others are very customized, or they're very custom. So basically when you're want to create a new object and things like that. Sorry. Woke up at 5 o'clock this morning. Got woken up by Bub. All right. So there are multiple ways you can do it. What we're going to do is go erase all this ink, and let's keep going. So another thing that you can do is we can create dictionary or hash tables. So basically, what a dictionary or hash table object is it really stores data, what we call key item pairs, versus an object where it would actually store object value as a property and then a value. So it's still an object. It still contains properties and values, but the data that you're wanting to store within it is stored as what we call a key item or a key value. Realistically, they can be used interchangeably. They can get a bit messy though. So generally, if you're working with one, stay with one. Don't try and convert to other objects. Try and stay with either, if you're using a hash table or a dictionary object, stay with a dictionary object or hash table. When you're using just normal PS object, stay with that. Now, dictionary hash table objects are really going to be used for, you can use them quite extensively in PowerShell. They're used for specific things called splatting and things like that. They're also used a lot in web APIs. So it's quite essential that you guys know about it. So obviously, property name equals key, property value equals item. To create a hash table, you denote the dollar with the open and curly brace and close it. Now it is different to the previous one. Now the previous one, remember how we talked about with defining type? Essentially, it is a hash table by this, but because we're specifying the type here, it's not. It actually is enforcing a specific type. So if we're using a PS object or a PS custom object, it will be that type. Oh, excuse me, sorry. All right, so they essentially are they're the same, but they are different because this is essentially type declaring the type, where by default it's if you just do it this way, it's not. It'll just default to a hash table. So just going to quickly clear that. Clear this. All right. Now we're going to go to demos at the end. So I'm just going to kind of try and speed through this, but essentially we're actually doing really well. We're making good time. So creating arrays and collections in PowerShell. So we've got a general array. Most of the time you're going to use this kind of what we call a no type, or it's just not. There's no type. It's not types. It's not strongly typed, what we call. So it's just an array. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Leave PowerShell to handle it. It'll deal with what type it is. That's completely fine. We can strongly type it by, again, what we did with the previous, what we did here is we basically are declaring the type. Now this is a little different because you can see here we've got an int32 and then we've got a square brackets inside the square brackets. That's telling PowerShell I'm an array, or in essentially I'm a list. So when you see a double bracket inside of a type, what you're basically seeing here is an array. This is basically saying there's a group of integers. So when we declare that, we obviously have the same thing. We're using the @ symbol, and then the parentheses. So that's pretty much that. So we can create an empty array. That's how we create an empty array. It's pretty straightforward. We're going to quickly go forward one slide. So like we said with, we're going to quickly talk about collections. So obviously the same thing. If you want to create a collection, it's like we said, collection equals get process. That's straightforward. Dynamically add to an object. So you know how before we created this empty array. Let's say you have an object and you want to be able to dynamically add to an object. So you want to be able to you want to dynamically build an array. You do that by using the plus equals. Now, this is not an efficient way of doing it. The reason why is what happens here is each time you add the object under the hood, PowerShell destroys the object. Destroys the existing collection. That's supposed to be an O, but like so. And then it rebuilds it. Now, this is really inefficient. The reason why it's inefficient is because if you're thinking about really big arrays, and we're talking millions and millions of rows, you'll see a performance slowdown, literally performance slowdown. I've actually I've actually had and exactly as well, memory usage issues. Now, there is times, this is when it comes down to best practices. So if you're working like traditionally, most of the time I will use this, especially when I'm just working with normal things. But if I'm working with things that are quite large and I know the size, so for example, I know that it's a specific size, I will declare the array and specify the size. Now, I'm not going to show you guys how to do that because that's something that it's a little bit too much in the deep end, but essentially there's tools there available to be able to do this. Now there's another way that you can dynamically build this, which doesn't go through this process of destroying and rebuilding, and you can create a special object called a system.item.arraylist. Now this is actually a C# object, but you can bring it into PowerShell. PowerShell except C, it's essentially just C#. PowerShell is C# under the hood, so it can take C#. So you can basically take that object and you can just basically add that way. Much more efficient, much quicker. You can get a massive performance increase. Now, essentially, the rule is if you're building something for production and things like that, you might want to go down that path. It really depends on how much you're wanting to process, but ultimately, this is realistically, this is a good default go-to. Like I still use this all the time. Like it's just easy, quick and easy to use. It's dirty, yes, but essentially it's quick and easy. If you're using small things, you won't notice the performance loss. Now, if you're using something large, I would start to rethink it. So it's definitely worth mentioning. So, creating arrays and collections in PowerShell. So we talked about, fantastic. I think I added this and then I kind of must have got distracted by something else. We'll skip that slide. We've already talked about indexing, so I don't think we actually need that. That was something I must have kind of missed. All right, and finally, creating classes in PowerShell. So creating classes in PowerShell. PowerShell 5 supports classes. Anything before PowerShell 5, it doesn't. Now, the classes, they are classes, so you can create objects. They are an object, but it's kind of a class. It's not a class like a C# class or a J# class or VB, any class that would be any language class that you would know. Essentially, it has certain features. It's class-like. Now, it's really good. Don't get me wrong. Like I use classes all the time. It was for the time being they were the quickest way of being able to do things in PowerShell. But yeah, classes are really used when you need to. Don't create classes for the sake of creating classes. So don't write a script and then have classes and everything. Classes are really used when you want to create like I use classes in a PowerShell modules because I'm trying to do specific aspects that I'm trying to do in that I would do in C#. So if I was basically, for example, let's use a web API and I need to refresh an API token, rather than having a specific function or something like that, it actually is better built into a class because then it's easier to maintain, it's easier to contain. Versus having it out in a separate function out here in the wild, it's just, it's a nice and easy, it's an easier way to group those elements together. So following the object-oriented method. Now, that's pretty much classes in terms of it's very simple, but yeah. Now, to create a class, we specify the class, and then we specify the class name. We say class name, and then we use our curly brace. Now, curly braces in PowerShell basically denote, PowerShell braces really denote code. So it's what we call a script block. I generally just think script block. So when I see curly brace, I think code. Essentially, code gets run in here. So when you see curly braces, think code. In this instance, it's in function. So you see a function, it follows the same process. It's just essentially group this code, curly braces. All right. So the first thing we can do here is we can specify the type. So I've just basically, obviously, square brackets. Then we've got our variable or our property. So this is obviously denoted by our variable $, and then our property. Now we can actually preset variables, so we can go property.equals 1 if we wanted to. That's completely fine. Then we've got our class name here. This is our constructor. Now you can see here, I've just got it wrapped. Basically, it's the class name. So if you've got a class name test, the constructor method here would be called test. Now we know it's a method because we can see this parentheses around at the end of it, at the end of sorry, just having a memory blank. We can see the parentheses at the end of the name. That basically is denoted by method. Now we have an additional method here. That's just a method that's called inside the object. That's a non-static method. Now, if we want to have a static method, we can just put a static next to it. We just write the word static. Essentially, we don't really need to know about that for the time being. We just need to know really these three of these four items: the class, the name, the type of the property, the class name, the constructor, and then the method. That's essentially how we create a class. So it's demo time. Let's create some classes. Let's do some cool things. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to minimize, I'm just going to end the show because it just gets discard all my ink annotations. So we're just going to jump up in here and we're going to go lesson 01 objects. So inside of here, we've just got some different things. So we obviously different types. We've got different exercises here. So first thing is, what we're doing is we're declaring a specific string. We're specifying a string and explicitly setting it. So if we go back to the notes, this is what we call a strongly typed string. This is strongly typed. We're actually explicitly setting the type. Now this will work. So if we run this and we run the string, we can see it's a type string. We're just going to call the getType method. And you can see there the type is our string. Now we're going to do this again. And we're going to specify an integer. And so let's rerun it. This is actually really bad because PowerShell is really, really, really good. It's going to be a type string. Oh man, this is bad. PowerShell, if we're using strings, PowerShell is like ruthless. So the reason why this works is because PowerShell just converted it to a string. I totally forgot about that. PowerShell will do that. So let's just have let's use another example. Let's just use integer because it'll try and do the same thing, but it won't work. So if we run just gonna quickly add the oh man. Now you can see here we've basically run this code. So we've got this is a string, and in here we can basically see that cannot convert value. This is a string to type system integer.32. Input string is not in the correct format. It will throw an error. It is tightly coupled. Now, if we remove this and rerun it, it works because PowerShell goes, it's whatever it is. It's a type string. It must be a string. So it takes whatever type this is and then sets the variable to be that type. So it's like, nah, I'll deal with it. So that's basically the difference between, that's what we call a strongly typed variable. Will fail. Now, that's just something I quickly want to obviously quickly touch on for you guys. So we're not, we've obviously, so you guys can see that in action. So next thing we're going to do is create some objects. So we're going to got a couple of different ways of creating objects here. So the first way we can create an object is we're going to use the new object variable. Now, the new object commandlet. So the new object commandlet, we can actually just do a quick get help on it. It's quite extensive. So I'm just going to quickly scroll up here. Actually, I'm just going to clear screen and do this again. So you can see here, new objects, creates an instance of a .NET framework or COM object. We're not going to talk about COM objects because that's VB script and we do not use COM objects. I've seen a lot of code out there that will use COM objects. If there is a .NET object, use the .NET object. Don't use the COM object because at the end of the day though, there are certain limitations of COM objects that just don't really make it really feasible to use anyway. It also limits your use. So basically you're locking yourself in. If you're especially writing for PowerShell core, you're locking yourself into Windows as a platform type. Rather than actually being able to write it to be for .NET Core, which means that you can then run it on Linux or Windows. All right, so new object. So we've got type string. We've got a whole bunch of different inputs. And then we obviously, let's have a quick look at the examples. You can see that it's quite extensive. We can use COM objects. We can use different things. It just varies. It basically, new object is really the way, if you want to create a quick object, that's one of the ways you can do it. So we're just going to use create an object. Helps if I actually document it. We're going to create an object, object, new object, type PS object. So if we actually get it, you can see it's completely empty. There is absolutely nothing in there. By the default elements within there, so toString get type hashcode equals, and it's a PS custom object, it's just an object. There's nothing special with it. Now we want to add a property to it. So what we can do is we can do this. So we can just run add member. So what we've done here is we've got objects, and then we're piping it to add member. So what add member does is it creates a property of object on the object property. So we're just going to create a property. The name of the property is going to be called property, and the value of the property is going to be called hello world. So let's do that. So now if we call object, it says hello world. Now I'm going to quickly show you guys a quick caveat of it. So this object, the object and property already exists. So sometimes when you see this, because the property exists, if we rerun this line, it will fail. The reason why is because the property already exists. So if you want to override it, you can use force, the force switch in PowerShell, and that will then override it. And it actually will reset that value. It's equivalent. It's not the best way of doing it, but it's just worth mentioning that. So if you're messing around in here and you're seeing, oh, the property already exists. How can it exist? The reason why is because, yeah, it exists. The object property exists. So if you want to, we can actually call it. So if we go object dot property, like so, you can see there's hello world, and we can actually change it. So we don't actually even need to use the force there. We can actually do it here. So we can go property, So we can now run this. So if we rerun this, you can see that we got object.property. There it is. So we've actually updated the property. So that's just one of the cool ways we can do that. The second way we can create an object, I'm just going to space that out, is we can use what we call the, we can use the hash table, but we can describe the type. So if we run this, again, I probably should put this as an object. Let me just declare this, put a variable in front of it, like so. And we can rerun this. So if we now run object, there's our property. We can then call it. So if we get the property, and we can actually change the property. So if we get the property, the property name. So if we get the property is value. That's what the initial value, that's what it was initially set there. And now we're going to change it. And so if we rerun this, now this is me, life should be fun for everyone. So that's basically another way that we can create a property. Now, another way we can do it is we can actually use what we call the default, we can use what we call a new. We can use the new method of the type. So the new method's basically attached to all objects in PowerShell if they have what we call they have a constructor. So let's create an object. So we've got our object. Let's have a look at it. Absolutely nothing there. Absolutely nothing there. Now we're going to add a property, and it's going to be, let's have a quick look at that object again. Oh, damn it. I've just rerun another piece of code. I'm just going to clear the screen because I'm. So if we check the object now, there's our property. So we can actually get that property. Again, that's another way we can create an object. I'm just let's change the object. So just grab this code up here. So it's exactly the same thing. Now, one thing I did forget to mention is that there are certain things within the number 2 example that is omitted from number 3 because it technically is a hash table. It's a really quick and dirty way of doing it, but essentially you can create objects this way. The recommended way I would do it is use either the new method, or use new object. This is really, you don't really need to use that. It's there for you to be able to do, but it's not essential. Like, it's not recommended. So we can then obviously change, what we're going to do is we obviously fetch the property, which is hello world. We're going to now change it. And now if we recall it, this is me, life should be fun for everyone. So that's number 3, using the PS object, the type : new method. The : basically says to PowerShell, I want to get static methods. So new is actually a static method. It's basically a static method that you can use to create it. Essentially, it's a constructor. So it's essentially just a constructor. So that's that one. Now we've got number 4. Now number 4 is basically using select object. Select object is a little different compared to the other ones. So select object is more for kind of formatting things and, like, getting things right in the pipeline. I'm not going to go to what we call select expressions because that's just, I think, is a little bit too much for today. We're going to revisit this later, probably in more of an advanced course, because I think right at this point in time, if I kind of take you guys down the rabbit hole, we're never going to come back. So get process, we're going to basically run this code, which is going to run get process, and then it's going to pipe the output of get process into select object. Now select object is essentially exactly what it sounds like. We're selecting an object, and then we're specifying those properties that we want to fetch. So in this instance, we're getting the name property and the ID property, and we're selecting the first object in the collection. So the reason why I've got that there is because if you remember with get process, if we remember from the previous demos, get process is a collection of objects. By saying give me the first one, we're only getting an object. We're not getting a collection. So it makes it a little bit easier for you guys to articulate what I'm talking about here. So If we run this, you can see this is the object that it's created. It's basically created, we have two properties. We have a name property and an ID property. So that's another way we can create objects. So we can actually look at those. So we can actually get them. Like so. So you can see there the value 5972, and then the object name is Adobe Update Service. So essentially, that is another way that you can create an object. Now, hash tables. We've talked about objects and hash tables. Hash tables are really, really handy. I have a fondness for hash tables because I work with a lot of API technologies. So it's something that I use quite extensively. Hash tables have a lot of added benefits that properties objects don't out of the box. But essentially, there are differences between the two that obviously with key items that basically make it a little bit more difficult to handle. Hash tables are essentially used in what we call splatting. We'll talk about splatting later, but basically they're used in APIs. One thing cool about especially with hash tables and splatting is that we can dynamically build things. So essentially, what splatting is basically did something there. I'm defining the parameters for a commandlet inside of here. So let's just go name is your phone. So if we run this like so, oops, we've got a lot of error. That should exist. Why is that not working? Why is that not working? Helps if I make it a string, Michael. So if we rerun this, you can see that is exactly the same as that. What it does, well, the reason why we have splatting is because it just you can simplify your code, your parameter base for a commandlet, but it also allows you to dynamically build things. And this is the thing I love about splatting is that, or with splatting in particular, is that with hash tables, you can actually dynamically add key item values to the dictionary, to the hash table or dictionary object. So I'm just going to have like so. Oops. To share code sometimes is not the best like that. So for example with the parameters, we'll just use this as an example. I just added another property by using the add method. The property name, the property value. Sorry, the key name, the key value or key item. So you can do really cool things with PowerShell where you're like, you could have a very complicated script where there's different elements of the script would require different parameters. Now it's the same commandlet name, but rather than having multiple if statements, you could just build it all out in a splat, and you could then just splat it. And splatting is so useful for that, where you can basically just say, here's all my parameters that I want to run, make it so. Now, one of the things with splatting is that you note that how the parameters, rather than using the rather than using the dollar symbol, I'm using the @ symbol. The @ symbol for a splat, that's how it denotes it as a splat. Now we're going to revisit splatting, so that's just a bit of a sneak peek, but essentially that's one of the benefits of having a hash table. But essentially a hash table is treated the same as an object, essentially. So if we go hashtable.key here, it helps if I actually run this code. If we run the code and then I'm just going to quickly clear the screen, and we go hashtable.key. Key. Actually, it's a bad example because I'm just going to call this Michael, and we're going to call hello world. Let's just do that because it makes it a bit easier. So let's just redeclare that. And if we go, you can see we've just called the hash table, and we've got the multiple keys. So we've got Michael and key. But if I want to call it, I can just go .Michael. And there's my value, hello world. Now, splatting is really useful. Oh, sorry, dictionary objects and hash tables are really, really useful. They're very, very quick. So if you need to quickly get something up, get something going, it's really, really useful. Objects, they have their different things. Now, PowerShell by default will handle it as an object, as per se, so you can reference it as an object. But it's definitely worth noting that when you're doing a lot of formatting, so you're compiling to JSON or doing things like that, it doesn't properly handle it. So you might have instances where you've got this, hash table which looks like an object. You do some sort of work, and then it just saying system.object, and you're thinking, what the hell's going on here? Essentially, it's how it's doing a conversion. So I think convert to CLI XML is a good example. It doesn't really like hash tables, but it's just worth noting that they are the same, but they essentially are different. Remember, they're different types, which makes them different. They're apples and oranges. They're dinosaurs and dogs. They're completely different. They look the same. Oh, sorry. Well, the dinosaurs in a dog outfit will probably look the same, but essentially they're different. Alrighty. All right, so let's create it. So we quickly talked about creating an array. So we're just going to create another array in PowerShell. So this is an array in PowerShell. So from 1 to 7. As you can see, I didn't declare the @ I didn't declare an array by using the @ and the parentheses operator. PowerShell just does it. Now, obviously, by default, I generally just do it because it makes it easy to read. They're exactly the same. They're treated the same. They're exactly the same. Now, one of the cool things is we can actually see the count of the array. So we're just going to go array.count, which is the count is a property of the array object. It's built when you instantiate the array. We can see that there's 6 items within that array. Now we want to let's obviously we want to index into that array. So we're going to go, okay, let's index. So we go array index 0. We're going to get the first element. We go 1, 2, 3. We can go -1. We get the last one. That's pretty much arrays. Now we can actually declare a strongly typed array. So a strongly typed array similar to a strongly typed variable. This one will fail because we have integers all the way up to 9, and then we've declared a string. We have a string that will basically say, nah, it's not in the right format. Now we can make that. We can now say, okay, let's create one that succeeds. So we can then just say 1 to 9. That will work. And if we have a look at the membership, actually we can just do get type. You can see it's an integer, or an int 32. We can obviously, again, use the count property. There's 8 items within that array. So remember, it's 0 based. Now, let's create an empty array and have a quick look at the count. I'm just going to quickly clear this again, and we can do this again. So you can see there's nothing in there. There's nothing in that array. And let's add something into that array. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the plus equals. So remember, like I said before, this is going to destroy the array and recreate it. But essentially, we're just adding into the array. So now we've run it. You can see that was really, really quick. Now we're going to do array count. And you can see there's now a value in there. Now let's just run this a few times. So we can actually just go run. Oh, we have to highlight each time. And you can see that it's adding. If we do a count, we now have 7 items within that array. So if we go have a look at the array, there's our items. And like I said, like we can do before, we can index into that. We can have a look at all the different values. Now it's all just 1, but essentially that's how you can dynamically build an array. Alrighty, we're actually really going well for time. It's 10:30, and I'm like, this is fantastic. So We're doing really, really well. The final thing is we're going to create a class in PowerShell. So here we have our property, like we have our class. So if it's this is our class statement. The class is called test. Now we have a property in there called hello world. The property we can set, we'll do whatever, but by default, we're actually going to make an adjustment and we're going to strongly type that property as a string. This is just force of habit. It also makes it easier to read. So we're going to strongly type that property to be hello as a string, and we're actually by default, when the object is created, that property will be hello world. It will have those values. Now we can clear it, that's fine. We can change it, that's all good. But essentially when it's created, it will be hello world. We're going to now create an empty one. Like so. So that's just an empty property. Straightforward. So now we've got our constructor. Our constructor is the method that gets executed when the object is created, and it has the same name as test. Now you can see here we have what we call, this is the default constructor. The default constructor is basically the constructor that doesn't have any sort of parameters. That's the one that when you create the object, new object, and you don't specify anything inside it, that's the default. That's the go-to. You have what we call now an overloaded constructor here. So as you can see here, we're using the parameter name. So we're using the amount of parameters in the method to be able to describe the overload. So in this instance, we have one parameter inside the method. Again, we're going to make a quick change to this. That's any type. It doesn't really care. It'll accept anything. I'm going to change that, and we're going to strongly type it to be a string. Now you can see that it's attached before the variable, making it a type. If it was attached after, that would be an index. But we're going to strongly type this to be a string. And then we just have this method. I've just created a random method in there. This method just gets run. There's nothing special about it. It's just a method. It's just executable code. And then let's go ahead and create this. So we've created this now. This class now, it exists in memory, but we haven't instantiated the object. We haven't created this object. So what we need to do now is we need to go ahead and create the object. So what we can do here is we're going to go ahead and create an object. So like we said, there's many different ways. We're going to use the : new method. So now we've created that object. That object now exists. So if we actually look at it, you can see we have our, actually we're going to use getMember because you can see in here, I'll just repost that. That's just been reposted, shoes. So when we, also didn't spell that right, OBJECT. When we run getMember on the object, we can see our method, terrible name, but it's just the method. And we can see our properties. We got empty property and property. So that's basically, essentially, we can see all the different methods and things that we've done for this class. Now there's other bits and pieces that's created by default for .NET, but essentially it's ours. It's our object. So what we can do now, as we created this default, we've created this default object. So let's go ahead and create it again. And you can see it wrote to the screen, hello world. That is the default property. So I've used this variable called this. This represents the default. It represents the current object that it's using property method. You don't need it. I just do it for readability. I'm not going to go any further into it because that's a little bit, again, that's a bit too deep. But essentially, it's just printing this out. It's just saying I want that property from this from the created object. So we're saying, and so it's going to print out hello world. Cool. It's pretty straightforward. So one of the things we can do now is we can actually have a look at the empty property. So if we go dot empty property, there'll be nothing in it. And we can actually do that. We can say equals null. It should equal to null. There you go. It's true. It's nothing in it. There's completely empty. Absolutely zilch. Nothing. That's exactly right. We can actually set things in it. So we can say, hello, this is Michael. And if we rerun it, there's a value. So we can set those values in it. That's completely fine. Now, one of the things I want to do is let's call that method. So we're going to call the method. So if we go object.method, remember we need to put the parentheses around it, and then we hit enter. Then we actually are calling this method, and then we're writing host. This is a method. So essentially, that's how we call our method, and we've called our method. Now, one of the things I want to quickly show you is a cool example of overloading here. So we've run our default constructor, but let's say for some whatever reason we want to write our own message out there. So what we can do here is we can actually rerun this line here. So on line 115, we've got here object test new, and then we're actually passing in a string called this is a message, custom message. That is going to tell PowerShell there's a parameter in here, and it looks at the count of the parameter, which is there's only one parameter, and then it will match it to this method, and then this method gets executed. So what we're going to do here is we should expect a custom message. So we can see this is a custom message. I can literally write whatever I want in here, and that's what it's going to write. And that's an example of an overloaded an overload of an overloaded constructor or / overloaded method. Now, one of the cool things I want to show you, though, is that it's just a type string. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and break this. Let's pass. I think the thing is, by default, PowerShell's really good at strings. So I don't think this is going to work, but let's give this a go. Let's put an array. Let's strongly type an array like so. And let's say 1, 2, 3. So what I'm doing is I'm strongly typing an array of an integer, and let's see what happens. I think this is going to work. Yep, it worked. PowerShell's fantastic. It basically just converted the integer into a string. But essentially, if we had the other way around and we had an integer and we had to pass an integer value, it would fail because it's expecting an integer type and we're passing a string. So if we flip this, I'm going to need to restart PowerShell. Now, the reason why I need to restart PowerShell is because right now we've created this class. If I try and reload this class, the class already exists. PowerShell just uses the original class. It doesn't actually replace it. So the easiest way to do that is we're just going to restart PowerShell. Once it comes back, let's go ahead and recreate our class. Now, if we try and recreate this, we'll try and rerun this now, it will fail because the overload is type integer. It's strongly typed. So now if we rerun this, we can see it's failed. It cannot convert the argument parameter, same thing. Custom with the value, this is a custom message, to type int 32. Input string is not in the correct format. So essentially, this is when you can create those strongly typed methods that you want to do something with, and it will fail if something's not passed into it. Now, there'll be reasons why you want to do that, especially with custom objects. You want a specific object only, because it makes it much easier to handle. So if someone else is using your code, they know it's that type object. If rather than having some random object and then it's kind of trying to suss it out, you just say, pass me that object. If you give me anything else, I'm not going to be happy with it. So that's pretty much it. I'm just going to quickly minimize that and go back to here. Demo time questions. So do you guys have any questions? That pretty much concludes today's lesson. We're actually a little bit ahead of time, which is fantastic. So do you guys have any questions with regards to what we've just covered? I'm going to literally leave it open for a little bit of time so you guys can kind of have a bit of a think about, let it digest. Now, one of the things I really quickly want to mention is if you haven't watched the first video, I definitely recommend you go ahead and watch the first video. While we're waiting on any sort of questions, I'm going to quickly open up Firefox. I'm just going to quickly go to YouTube. I've actually created a playlist, so we can pretty much go straight to that. So if we go to the Brisbane PowerShell user group, that's me. So we've got a whole bunch of playlists, but essentially PowerShell101Live, that's the one. So you can see here, that's it here. So you can see the second one's just been added into it, and that's one of the cool things with events. But if you really want to rewatch this, definitely this is the place to go and check it out. So yeah, anyway, questions? Anyone got questions? No worries, Shu, mate. No worries. That's all good, mate. Alrighty. What we might do, again, you can throw questions on Twitter, you can throw them on Discord, all good. We might as well, I think we can wrap it up. We're actually on time, which is really good. It's 10:49. We're a little bit early. It's a little bit better than last time. I was pushing and I was trying to get everything done. I had to skip some demos, but I think we're doing really well today. So that's actually an excellent outcome for everyone, which is good because it's finishing on time. It makes my wife happy. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know that there was a lot of action on the front end of this. I think it did peter off. So I don't know how everyone is going with it. If it was a little bit too deep, let me know. If it wasn't deep enough, definitely let me know. I am planning to run an advanced course, but this one should ride us all the way into December. So I'm thinking I might run an advanced course in PowerShell on over next year. So it'll be probably in the January period. And we're going absolutely bananas. We're going to be writing modules. We're going to be doing crazy things. So we're going to be looking at API technologies, all those kinds of things. Quick question. Could you do a stream in the future on shell scripting to remove Windows 10 default Windows Server 2006 optimizing? Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here. So to do on shell scripting to remove Windows 10 default and Windows Server 2016 and 2019 junk, optimizing things like that. Yeah, I can definitely do a separate stream on that. That's no issue. I think the biggest thing with that is that's obviously really tailored towards a specific instance. So I'm guessing you're probably going to be leaning towards all the really annoying all the annoying bits and pieces like features, Windows features, things like that. All the other bits and pieces like Apex packages and things like that. So yeah, that's actually a fairly easy course to do. Like Windows Server, turning off services not needed, saving RAM performance apps, Windows 10. So really you can't, like, at the end of the day though, it really comes down to what you're wanting to do. So if you wanted to turn services and things like that off, you can just use stop service. So what I think would be really more likely where you'd be able to target that would be, you'd probably get more out of the course, would be the desired state configuration. I'd say that because instead of having a script that does that, desired state configuration is essentially defining that configuration state. Hey, I want to have these services stopped. I want these Apex packages removed. I want all these registry entries cleared out. and defining a state and then putting DSC in charge of that state. Because DSC is in charge of that state, it means that then DSC would maintain that, and you don't even have to touch it. DSC would be responsible for maintaining the state. So DSC is part of this course. It's the very, very, very last step in it. The reason why is because DSC is the second kind of pillar of PowerShell. You got PowerShell scripting, and then we have PowerShell DSC. DSC is really kind of that's going down the advanced road. So I hope that answers your question. I do think that that's probably a better way to write the code. So definitely what I would be thinking about if you're thinking about doing this is think about what you want to have stopped. So think about the technical requirements, and then using those technical requirements, start thinking about how you would go to make that happen. So I had an assessment where, to create a VM, things like that, that's completely really your it's basically just a bit of a bread and butter kind of assessment. If you want to do that as your assessment, work out what you need to do and then script it. Now, scripting it's going to be fairly easy because you're just going to define a whole bunch of configuration. I'll just be using a CSV file. If you're going to script it, a CSV file. Here's my services that I want. Here's my registry entries I want removed. Here's some Apex packages that need to be gone. Do it. But you're probably going to refactor that code really, really quickly into DSC, because DSC is a better way to do it. All right, so the next question we had was, what does the advanced course consist of? I have no bloody idea. I think the advanced course is going to be really more focusing on writing code and fundamentals. We're going to be exploring APIs. We're going to be exploring really getting down in the dirt with PowerShell, writing PowerShell properly. Writing it using .NET objects to their absolute limit, pushing PowerShell to doing what it's supposed to do. So kind of, we got our commandlets, we got our scripts, and then we're going to be like, yeah, okay, let's write an aimbot, like that. That was actually one of the things I did back in PowerShell 3, which was a very, very long time ago. I wrote a PowerShell aimbot in Battlefield 4 for the sake of pushing PowerShell to see what it can do. So, yeah. Creating commandlets. Yes, commandlets actually, so modules and things like that would be incorporated into it. So basically, I did in the very last session of PowerShell 101 with Michael and Christian, I did touch on commandlets and creating modules with commandlets, but we can definitely go back into that, and we can definitely go right down into the architecture of actually creating modules, which is really, really something quite in depth. Did you do any stream on using SIM? No streams on using SIM. Just focusing on the fundamentals. I'm not going to be using SIM at the moment. SIM will be probably, to be honest, I probably can add it later. We've got the curriculum. Let me just grab the curriculum, 2 secs. Let me just grab the curriculum. So essentially, we're going to be doing PowerShells and objects, PowerShell filtering, PowerShell looping. So just covering the fundamentals, scripting in PowerShell, debugging, PowerShell get around. It might actually fall into this one, which is just using SIM. SIM is a bit, I do think it's kind of, it's useful, but at the same time though, I'm kind of like, it's really kind of outside the scope of the course in terms of it's a little bit advanced. I don't particularly want to go. It really depends. I'll see how I go. We'll see how we go. I love what you're doing here, and I plan on being around as I progress. Very excited for quality content Twitch like this. Thanks. No worries, man. Really appreciate it. No worries. I've been doing some PowerShell with WMI inquiries. Very interesting what you can get from hardware performance calls with WMI and a shell script. Yes. So SIM WMI, to give you a bit of context with WMI, do you have a donation thing? No, I don't really like. At the end of the day, though, I'm kind of not trying to monetize anything because I don't particularly I'm just doing this out on my own. I think empowering the community is more important than any sort of donations. And at the end of the day, I think keep your own money. Go get yourself a coffee. That's how I see it. Yeah. Maybe later down the line, BrizPug will probably be asking for donations, but for myself, I'm not doing this off my back. PowerShell with WMI inquiry is very interesting. Yes, so WMI is actually really, really powerful. So with WMI, it has insane, like this is kind of going back to the VB script days. So you could do, back in the day, if you wanted to do any sort of crazy code in VB script outside of what VB script was able to do, which was just COM objects, you could use WMI. WMI was pretty much your Windows System 30, Windows subsystem. The thing with WMI though, I found, was that there's a lot of cool stuff in there. I think though you might find, is it Truzido? Sorry, Truzido. Essentially, it's you can pretty much do the exact same with .NET. So when we kind of go into the advanced, Truzido. Essentially with .NET, you can do pretty much the exact same thing. So a great example was I had to write a C#. Essentially, I had to write some C# to change network configurations and things like that. And I was like, I could just use WMI, because WMI is exactly what it's. You could get that out. But essentially, yeah, you have .NET there. So WMI, the sim is there. Like, for example, to be honest, like a lot of products out there, like SSCM and things like that, will use sim. But essentially, if you're writing WMI, like you can kind of get you can get away with a lot of it from .NET anyway. So, but WMI is hard and sim is faster. I guess what I've tried. Yeah, yeah. It's faster and easier in PowerShell. Yes, it is. It's way easier in PowerShell. Writing in VB script was the worst. Anyway, guys, that is 11 o'clock. Actually, it's 10 seconds before 11 o'clock. But essentially, that is it. So, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you loved it, subscribe to the Twitch. It's always good. Don't worry about donations. I'm all good. Yeah, all I want to see you guys next time. That's really what it's going to be about. So yeah, don't forget, if another thing as well, if you think someone else or one of your colleagues is trying to learn PowerShell, something like that, send them this. It's going to basically help them a lot more. Obviously, there's thousands of courses out there, learn PowerShell in a month of lunches and things like that. But the biggest thing is, realistically, the only reason why it's done for free, so it's free. That's the reason why. It's pretty much that. So a lot of other courses out there, they'll teach the exact same content. It's just this is free, and yeah, this is live, and it's live. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a good evening if you're in America. Have a good morning if you're in Europe, and have a good day if you're in Australia. All right, bye for now.